What we know is that the producer Oshin Tiemann was indeed attacked by Jeremy Clarkson, and he was also subjected to sustained verbal abuse, using words that no one should have to endure. We all know that Jeremy is a huge talent.
What happens when one of Britain's most controversial television stars loses everything and somehow comes back bigger than before? Jeremy Clarkson's story is far more complicated than fast cars, angry headlines, and controversial opinions. From a modest childhood in Doncaster and a struggling start in journalism, Clarkson built himself into the face of Top Gear, only to lose his BBC career after a shocking backstage incident. But that wasn't the end. Amazon came calling, the grand tour followed, and then an unexpected farming experiment transformed into the diddly-squat empire, complete with a farm shop, brewery, pub, and millions in sales. So how did Clarkson turn controversy, failure, and unlikely opportunities into a business empire? Let's uncover the story. The making of Jeremy Clarkson. Jeremy Clarkson was born on the 11th of April 1960 in Doncaster, a South Yorkshire town built on coal mining and modest expectations. Not exactly the natural launching pad for a man who'd later be photographed next to prime ministers. His parents sold Paddington Bear toys for a living. It sounds whimsical until you understand what it actually meant day to day. A small, precarious business in a town that didn't have much patience for small, precarious businesses. The family wasn't poor, but they weren't comfortable either, and Clarkson grew up with the kind of low-grade financial anxiety that tends to shape people in one of two directions. It either breaks you, or it turns you into someone determined never to feel that way again. He was sent to Repton School in Derbyshire on a partial scholarship, one of England's old boarding schools, filled with boys who had money Clarkson didn't have, confidence he hadn't yet built, and a kind of easy entitlement he apparently found both infuriating and magnetic at the same time. By his own account, he wasn't a distinguished student, spectacularly average academically, and rather more talented at causing trouble than passing exams. But looking back, you can already see the outline of who he'd become. Someone who couldn't sit quietly in a room, who had a compulsive need to perform, and who seemed to have a natural instinct for figuring out exactly what would make people stop and stare. He left Repton without any particular academic distinction and went straight into local journalism, the Rotherham Advertiser, then the Wolverhampton Express and Star. Small papers, small stories, the unglamorous grind that most people who eventually become broadcasting legends prefer not to bring up once they're famous. But here's where something important actually happened. Clarkson discovered, almost by accident, that he had an unusual gift. He could make people care about things they didn't think they cared about. He could write about a car, just an object, 4 wheels and an engine, with the kind of emotional intensity most writers save for love affairs or family tragedies. And people kept reading. They kept coming back for more. Cars were the entry point. But if you look closely, cars were never really what he was selling. He was selling himself, his perspective, his outrage, his genuine, slightly bewildering enthusiasm for a world where everything was either magnificent or an absolute catastrophe, with almost nothing comfortable in between. Top Gear existed long before Jeremy Clarkson did. Most people forget that now. It was a perfectly respectable, moderately dull BBC motoring program, the kind of show you'd half watch on a Sunday evening. When Clarkson joined as a presenter in 1988, nobody predicted what was about to happen to it. The transformation wasn't instant. These things rarely are. But it was steady, and it felt almost inevitable in hindsight, because Clarkson had figured out something about television that most people working in television hadn't quite grasped yet. Audiences don't primarily want information, they want a personality. They want someone to tell them what to think, how to feel, and why any of it should matter to them. They want theater, not a spec sheet. By the mid-1990s, Clarkson had become a genuinely recognizable face. The hair, the jeans, that specific combination of working-class Doncaster grit and self-taught intellectual confidence. He was writing columns for the Sunday Times that people actually argued about at dinner tables, which is about the highest compliment a newspaper columnist can receive. He was becoming famous, first quietly, and then all at once. By the early 2000s, the relaunched Top Gear, bigger, louder, more absurdly expensive to produce, was being watched by hundreds of millions of people in countries Clarkson probably couldn't reliably point to on a map. The Stig became a genuine cultural phenomenon. Celebrity lap times turned into appointment viewing. Richard Hammond and James May became the supporting cast in a show that, at its core, was always really about Clarkson. His opinions, his prejudices, his strange genius for making a 40-minute film about 3 old cars feel like the single most important thing happening in the world that week. And then, as tends to happen with almost everything involving Clarkson, it all went spectacularly, publicly wrong. Clarkson's BBC breaking point. The word fracas entered everyday British vocabulary in March 2015, largely because the BBC itself used it in an official statement. And it's stuck to this story ever since. It's a strangely genteel word for what actually happened, and that gap between the word and the incident is part of why the story has stayed alive for a decade. Here's what actually happened, as best as it's been publicly established. After a long day of filming in North Yorkshire, Clarkson's producer, Oisin Timon, a man who'd worked on Top Gear for years, was struck by his presenter. The apparent trigger, as far as anyone has been able to piece together, was the absence of a hot meal at the end of the shoot. It sounds almost absurdly small when you say it out loud. A missing plate of food ending one of the biggest careers in British television. But that's precisely what makes it such a revealing moment. Clarkson later said, exhaustion, combined with the stress of a recent family bereavement, had pushed him past his limit that night. Timon chose not to file a formal complaint. The BBC suspended Clarkson anyway, and what followed became one of the defining British public debates of that decade. Not really about the incident itself, but about what a broadcaster owes its audience versus what it owes its staff. Over 1 million people signed a petition demanding Clarkson be reinstated. Newspaper columnists wrote genuinely passionate defenses of a man who had, by his own account, hit a colleague. It's worth stepping back and looking at that for a second, because it's a strange thing for a country to collectively decide. A huge number of people concluded that losing Clarkson was the bigger problem. Bigger, in the moment, than the fact that he'd assaulted someone he worked with. Many people seemed to genuinely believe he was irreplaceable, that no version of Top Gear without him could possibly work. The BBC apparently didn't agree. Director General Tony Hall announced that Clarkson's contract would not be renewed. Top Gear, or at least the format of it, would continue on without him, with new presenters brought in to fill a chair that, as it turned out, was much harder to fill than anyone at the BBC had anticipated. It's worth noting how genuinely split the public reaction was, because it says something about how people saw him by that point in his career. To his critics, the episode confirmed exactly what they'd suspected for years, that Clarkson's persona had curdled from provocative into something closer to entitled, a man who'd been indulged for so long that consequences no longer felt real to him. To his defenders, the same episode read differently. A talented, difficult man being punished disproportionately by an institution that had happily profited from his difficulty for decades, only turning on him once it became publicly inconvenient not to. Neither camp fully persuaded the other, and honestly, neither has fully backed down since. You can still find both arguments being made today, almost word for word, whenever his name comes up. What's easy to miss, looking back, is that this wasn't really a story about a punch. It was a story about an institution finally deciding a line had been crossed. After years of tolerating behavior it had previously treated as part of the package. Losing the biggest job in British motoring broadcasting would have quietly ended most careers. For a moment, it genuinely looked like it might end Clarkson's too. Except it didn't, not even close. And what happened in the months right after his BBC exit is where this story actually starts getting interesting. The BBC lost, Amazon won. Within months of leaving the BBC, Clarkson had signed a deal with Amazon Prime Video for a new show called The Grand Tour. The numbers involved were reportedly in the region of 10 to 12 million pounds a year, a genuinely enormous sum for a presenter the BBC had just decided wasn't worth the risk of keeping. Sit with that contrast for a second. One company looked at the punch, the headlines, the reputational cost, and decided Clarkson wasn't worth it anymore. A different company looked at the exact same incident and decided it was worth tens of millions of pounds a year to put him back on camera. Same man, same scandal, two completely different verdicts on what he was actually worth. It's worth asking why Amazon made that call when the BBC didn't. Part of the answer is simply appetite for risk. A streaming platform trying to establish itself globally had far more to gain from a splashy, headline-grabbing signing than a century-old public broadcaster answerable to license fee payers and government oversight. But part of it was almost certainly colder than that. Amazon had watched the ratings, watched the petition, watched the outrage on both sides, and concluded that controversy, in this particular case, wasn't a liability. It was free marketing. Clarkson, Richard Hammond, and James May reconvened, this time inside an enormous, lavishly produced tent that traveled the world with them, city to city, continent to continent, at a production cost that made even Top Gear's famously bloated budgets look modest by comparison. They proceeded to make essentially the same show under a different name, for an audience that turned out to be, if anything, even bigger than the one they'd left behind at the BBC. It was proof of something television executives don't always like to admit out loud. Audiences weren't loyal to Top Gear, the format. They were loyal to Clarkson, Hammond, and May specifically. The BBC had spent 30 years building a brand, and it turned out a huge chunk of that brand's actual value had legs, and those legs walked straight to Amazon, taking millions of viewers with them. There's a broader lesson buried in that, one that goes beyond Clarkson himself. Institutions tend to believe they're bigger than any single person who works for them, right up until that person leaves and takes the audience with them. The BBC had the format, the crew, the brand history, and the name recognition. What it didn't have anymore was the one ingredient that had actually been driving the numbers for 2 decades. You can own every asset associated with a show and still lose if the thing people were actually tuning in for walks out the door. But while the Grand Tour was busy becoming a global hit, something else, something almost nobody was paying attention to at the time, was quietly building in the background, years before any of this BBC drama had even happened. At the height of the 2008 financial crisis, while banks were failing and stock markets were in freefall, Clarkson had spent roughly £6 million buying about 1,000 acres of farmland in the Cotswolds. His friends reportedly thought he'd lost his mind. Land that size, in that location, bought by a television presenter with no agricultural knowledge and, by his own admission, very little patience for anything that moved slowly. His farm manager, a young man named Caleb Cooper, who was already working the land when Clarkson bought it, later described trying to teach him basic farming as something close to explaining a genuinely complicated subject to an enthusiastic but easily distracted student. Affectionately meant, but with real, ongoing bewilderment attached. It wasn't exactly a promising start for what would eventually become a multi-million-pound operation. For years, the farm sat somewhere between a hobby, a tax strategy, and a convenient excuse to buy an extremely large tractor. Nobody, least of all Clarkson, seemed to treat it as a serious business. In its first full year of serious operation, it made a profit of exactly £144, reportedly less than Clarkson earned for a single episode of television, and barely enough to cover a decent lunch for the crew. Then Amazon started filming it, and something nobody quite expected happened. People actually cared. Not in the polite way audiences sometimes extend to countryside programming either. This was different. It was the kind of attention people give to something that feels genuinely true, unscripted, and a little chaotic. rather than something manufactured for the camera. What started as background footage for a man already famous for cars was about to become the more interesting story entirely. How Clarkson built the farm empire. Here's what most critics of Clarkson tend to miss, and what most of his fans understand instinctively, but rarely put into words. He isn't fundamentally a controversialist manufacturing outrage for its own sake, even if he's clearly learned to package outrage efficiently over the decades. He's a man who feels things very strongly and has never had much interest in pretending otherwise. He finds bureaucracy genuinely maddening. He finds small-mindedness genuinely offensive. He finds real competence and excellence genuinely moving. And for 50 years, he's built an audience out of people who feel exactly the same way and enjoy watching someone say it loudly on their behalf. That authenticity, chaotic, stubborn, occasionally infuriating, turned out to be exactly what made the farm compelling television, and eventually, a real business. Diddley Squat Farm Shop started as, essentially, a shed with some potatoes in it. It became enough of a local traffic problem that police reportedly had to manage queues stretching for miles along country lanes that hadn't seen that kind of disruption in decades. Visitors came from every corner of Britain and beyond to buy jars of things with names like bee juice and cow juice, overpriced preserves, and, whether they could fully articulate it or not, a sense of connection to something that felt honest in a world that had mostly stopped bothering to be. The financials tell the story more precisely than any anecdote could. Within a single year of serious operation, the shop's assets reportedly went from around £44,000 to over £1.3 million. That's not a hobby slowly turning profitable. That's a business being born, somewhat chaotically, in exactly the way you'd expect from a man who's openly admitted that financial planning was always something other people did for him. Then came Hawkstone Lager, brewed from barley grown on his own land and on neighboring farms, rather than imported from wherever happened to be cheapest that season. Grown by farmers in Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire, who'd worked that same soil for generations, and who suddenly had a guaranteed buyer willing to pay a fair price, instead of being at the mercy of unpredictable grain markets. By 2025, Hawkstone had reportedly posted sales of over £21 million, nearly tripling from the previous year's £7.8 million, itself already considered a strong result. That's roughly 134% annual growth, enough to land Hawkstone among the fastest-growing private companies in Britain. The beer ended up on shelves at major UK supermarkets and in thousands of pubs nationwide. One advertising campaign, farmers singing a deliberately rude song about how good the beer tasted, got formally banned by the UK's Advertising Standards Authority, and was then watched by well over 1 million people online anyway. Most people who followed the story agreed the ban was, in practical terms, some of the best marketing the brand could have possibly received. And it's hard to imagine Clarkson didn't understand exactly that when he approved the campaign in the first place. He also opened a pub, the Farmer's Dog, built almost entirely around British-sourced ingredients, including black pepper, reportedly sourced from Cornwall at roughly 10 times the cost of the imported version, British beef instead of cheaper imports, and a wine list that apparently caused his accountant real distress. He's been open about the fact that the pub essentially loses money on food while making it back on Hawkstone Lager, where he keeps the full profit margin. He's described the approach as loss-leading with a bit of style, and looking at the actual numbers, that description holds up. The pub reportedly employs around 146 people. Looked at as a whole, what seems on the surface like commercial eccentricity is actually a fairly coherent, vertically integrated business model. The pub exists partly to showcase British farming, partly as a filming location for future series, and partly to sell Hawkstone at full margin to customers who came for the food and left having bought the beer. Meanwhile, the farmland itself, bought for roughly £6 million during the depths of the 2008 financial crisis, while almost everyone else was selling, is now conservatively valued at around £12.5 million. He's more than doubled his money simply by holding onto the land before you even count a single potato sold, a single pint poured, or a single hour of television footage. Look at that timing for a second, because it matters. In 2008, while banks were collapsing and property values across Britain were in freefall, most people with £6 million to spare were looking for safety, not risk. Clarkson bought 1,000 acres of unglamorous farmland instead, an asset class most of his peers wouldn't have looked at twice. Whether that was foresight, stubbornness, or simple luck depends on who you ask. But the arithmetic, 17 years later, doesn't much care which explanation you prefer. The man behind the controversy. Behind the business empire, there's a more personal story that's easy to lose in the numbers. His first marriage, to Alexandra Hall, ended quietly, without children, years before any of this began. In 1993, he married Frances Kane, who became not just his wife, but reportedly a significant part of his commercial success behind the scenes. And together, they had 3 children, Emily, Finlo, and Katya. From the outside, it looked like a formidably solid unit for over 2 decades. The marriage ended in 2014, after 21 years, though Francis reportedly remained involved in the business side of his operations afterward. A kind of pragmatic, ongoing working relationship that the press generally found less interesting than the divorce itself. He later began a relationship with Lisa Hogan, who has since become a familiar presence alongside him on the farm. In 2023, his health became a genuine news story when he revealed he'd been diagnosed with a narrowed artery and had undergone medical procedures to address it. He reportedly handled the revelation with characteristic directness, a mix of real alarm and the kind of dark humor you'd expect from someone who has, by his own admission, not exactly lived the lifestyle of a man prioritizing his cardiovascular health. There's a temptation, telling a story like this, to try to resolve Clarkson into something tidy, either a villain who got lucky or a misunderstood talent who deserved better. The honest answer is that he's neither, and both, depending on which part of the story you happen to be looking at. He's a working-class boy who went to a public school and spent decades performing a version of establishment confidence he had to build entirely from scratch. He built 2 decades of television around cars with enormous engines, while later being credited by farmers themselves for doing more to raise public awareness of British agriculture than 30 years of conventional countryside broadcasting managed. He's a businessman who's openly claimed not to understand business, while quietly building one of the most sophisticated commercial operations in rural England. He's a self-described man of the people who lives in a manor house in the Cotswolds and charges roughly £9 for a jar of honey. None of those contradictions are incidental to who he is. They're basically the entire story. And looked at honestly, they're not a bad reflection of certain tensions in British culture more broadly. A lingering class anxiety, a deep suspicion of expertise sitting right alongside real respect for genuine competence. A capacity for public outrage matched by an even bigger capacity for forgiveness, provided someone makes the whole thing entertaining enough to forgive. The farming establishment, initially wary of a television celebrity playing at their profession, came around over time. The British Farming Awards later recognized him for doing more for agricultural awareness than 3 decades of conventional countryside programming had achieved. A genuinely notable admission from an industry that had every reason to dismiss him early on, and largely didn't stay dismissive for long. He said things over the years that were simply wrong, and some things considerably worse than wrong. He's apologized for some of them with what looks like real sincerity, and not apologized for others with what looks like equal sincerity. Roughly the proportion you'd expect from someone whose main loyalty has always been to his own judgment, rather than to whatever the prevailing mood of the room happens to be. His defenders find that refreshing. His critics find it unforgivable. Both reactions, in their own way, are reasonable. They're not actually mutually exclusive. What's harder to argue with is what he's actually built, and who it's affected. Hundreds of jobs in rural communities that had been steadily losing them. A brewery that gave local farmers a market they didn't have before, at prices they could rely on. A farm shop that proved, more convincingly than any government rural policy paper ever could, that people will drive for hours to buy something they genuinely believe in. It's tempting to treat that as an accident, a lucky pivot by a famous man with money to burn. But the pattern holds up too consistently across his career to be pure luck. Every single time an institution decided Clarkson was more trouble than he was worth, he found an audience willing to disagree, and built something new on top of that disagreement. That's not luck. That's a fairly specific, repeatable skill, even if it's one he's never described in those terms himself. So that's the answer to how Jeremy Clarkson turned controversy, failure, and unlikely opportunities into a business empire. He never actually recovered from any of it quietly. He turned a BBC firing into an Amazon deal, and a farm that made £144 into a multi-million-pound operation spanning television, brewing, retail, and hospitality. Every institution that decided he was too much handed him the exact audience he needed to build something bigger somewhere else. He's not a comfortable man, and he's never pretended to be one. But love him or not, it's hard to argue with the arithmetic. National treasure or professional troublemaker? Tell me your verdict in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this one.